1944. A German position along a paved road in France, and a sound is approaching that a German soldier, by this stage of the war, could identify with his eyes closed. Tanks. If you were that soldier, you knew the sound of tanks on a road, and you knew it as one of the most distinctive noises of the war. The squealing, grinding, clattering roar of steel tracks on a hard surface, a metallic scream that carried for miles, that announced armor long before you could see it, that tore the road surface to pieces as it passed. That was, quite simply, what a tank sounded like. Your own tanks made it. Every tank you had ever heard made it. It was the voice of armor, and it was the sound of steel grinding against stone. And then the American tanks came down the road, and the sound was wrong. It was quieter, not silent. Nothing about a 30-ton machine is silent, but the metallic scream was muted, softened, replaced by something more like a heavy rolling rumble. The tanks moved faster on the paved road than yours did, and they did not tear the road to shreds behind them, the way steel tracks did, and there was, underneath the engine noise, a strange, almost cushioned quality to the sound that did not fit anything you knew about tanks. And if you got close enough to examine one, knocked out or captured, you found the reason. And it was so simple and so strange that it seemed almost frivolous. The American tank had rubber on its tracks. Not entirely rubber, the track was still a steel structure, as any track must be. But set into it, or forming the surface that met the road, were blocks and pads of rubber. The part of the track that actually touched the ground was, in large measure, rubber. The American tank was rolling across France on rubber, where your tank rolled on bare steel. The conclusion available to a German engineer or officer was, at first, bafflement shading into contempt. Rubber? On a tank track? Rubber is soft. Rubber wears out. Rubber is a scarce strategic material that no sane nation would waste on something as brutal as a tank track, which exists to grind across the worst terrain on Earth. Putting rubber on a tank track seemed like a category error, a soft, precious material used for a savage, punishing job. It looked, like so much about the American war machine, faintly ridiculous. He was wrong, and the rubber on the track was not frivolous at all. It was the visible sign of a series of connected decisions, each one rational, each one expensive, that together revealed the same philosophy this channel has traced through fuel and food and medicine and mail. A philosophy about reliability, about the crew, about the long war, and about a nation so materially dominant that it could afford to put a scarce strategic resource on the very bottom of its tanks, where it met the road. Because here is the thing the rubber track actually did, and it is a longer list than you would think, and every item on it mattered. This is not a story about tracks. This is a forensic audit of a small, strange, telling detail, the rubber on the bottom of an American tank, and of how that one detail contained, in miniature, the reliability, the crew care, the industrial depth, and the sheer material wealth that separated the two armies, all the way down to the surface where steel meets the road. Part 1. The German Calculus. We have to begin by understanding why the German tank ran on bare steel, because it was not stupidity or backwardness. It was, as always, a rational response to constraints that America did not share. The German tank track was a superb piece of engineering in its own terms. German tanks used all steel tracks, and for the job of gripping bad terrain, mud, snow, broken ground, the churned battlefields of the Eastern Front, steel tracks with aggressive cleats were, in many ways, excellent. Steel bites, steel grips. On the worst ground, a bare steel track with good cleats could claw its way through conditions that would defeat a smoother surface, and the German tank, designed with the horrors of the Russian mud and snow very much in mind, was built to grip. So the German choice of steel was not merely a limitation. It was, in part, a genuine design preference for maximum grip on the worst terrain, and on that specific measure it was a reasonable choice. But underneath the design preference sat the same iron constraint that shaped every German decision in this war, and it is the constraint that made steel not just a preference but a necessity. Germany did not have rubber. Rubber in the 1940s came overwhelmingly from tropical plantations, from Southeast Asia above all, and those sources were controlled by, or cut off from, the combatants in specific ways. Natural rubber was one of the most strategically critical materials of the entire war, and Germany, blockaded and cut off from the world's tropical rubber, was chronically, desperately short of it. Every scrap of rubber Germany could obtain or synthesize was needed for the most essential uses: tires, seals, gaskets, the countless applications where there was simply no substitute. In that situation, the idea of putting rubber on a tank track, a component subjected to the most brutal wear imaginable, that would grind the rubber away and demand more, was close to unthinkable. Germany could not spare rubber for tires and gaskets, let alone squander it on the bottom of a tank, where it would be chewed to pieces by the terrain. Steel tracks were not just a design choice, they were the only choice a rubber-starved economy could make. You cannot put rubber on your tanks when you do not have enough rubber for your trucks. And Germany's synthetic rubber effort, real and technically impressive as it was, could never come close to meeting the total demand. Germany pioneered synthetic rubber production. The German chemical industry was among the best in the world, and it built synthetic rubber plants. But the output, while significant, was nowhere near enough to satisfy an entire war economy's needs, and it consumed enormous resources of coal, chemicals, and energy that were desperately needed elsewhere. The synthetic rubber that Germany did produce went to the most critical uses, and tank tracks were not among them. So the German tank rolled on bare steel, gripping the mud superbly, screaming down the roads, tearing up the pavement, and wearing in a particular way that we will come to, and it did so not because German engineers had never thought of rubber, but because the rubber did not exist to be used, and steel was what a blockaded, resource-poor power could actually make. That is the German calculus, a steel track that was genuinely excellent at gripping bad terrain, chosen partly on merit but mostly by necessity, because Germany's catastrophic rubber shortage made putting rubber on a tank track an impossible luxury for a nation that could not even keep its trucks and tires. The bare steel track was one more expression of the fundamental German condition, a resource-poor power making the hard, necessary choices that scarcity forced upon it. Now let us look at why the Americans put a scarce strategic material on the bottom of their tanks anyway. Part 2. The American answer. The American decision to use rubber on tank tracks looks, at first, like exactly the kind of wasteful extravagance the German officer suspected. But when you look at what the rubber actually did, you find that it was not extravagance at all. It was a series of hard-headed engineering decisions, each of which bought something real, and together they reveal the whole American way of thinking about machines and the men who ran them. Let us go through what the rubber track bought, because the list is long and every item matters. First, and most importantly, track life. This is the one that surprises people, because the intuition is that rubber, being soft, would wear out faster than steel. But the reality on hard surfaces is the reverse. A bare steel track running on paved roads wears out remarkably quickly. The steel-on-stone contact grinds the track components down, and steel tracks had a relatively short life measured in road miles before they were worn out and had to be replaced. The rubber-faced track, cushioning that contact, lasted far longer on roads, dramatically longer. An American tank could road march for a great distance on its tracks before they wore out, where a steel track tank would have chewed through its tracks in a fraction of that distance. In a war of movement, fought increasingly on the road networks of Western Europe, track life was a huge practical advantage, because a tank with worn-out tracks is a tank in the workshop, not a tank in the fight. Second, speed and road performance. The rubber-faced track allowed the tank to move faster on roads, and to do so without destroying either the track or the road. The American Army, fighting a war of rapid movement and depending utterly on the road network for its logistics, needed its tanks to be able to road march quickly and repeatedly, and the rubber track made that possible. A steel track tank moving fast on a paved road is a machine tearing itself and the road apart. A rubber track tank can cover the miles. Third, and this connects directly to a theme we have traced through the whole series, crew preservation and effectiveness. Steel tracks on a hard surface transmit tremendous vibration and noise into the tank. The crew of a steel-track tank on a road march endured a punishing, exhausting assault of vibration and metallic din, hour after hour. The rubber track cushioned that, reducing the vibration and the noise, making the tank quieter and smoother and far less exhausting to ride in. And a crew that arrives at the battlefield less exhausted, less rattled, less deafened, is a crew that fights better, that shoots straighter, reacts faster, thinks more clearly. We have seen this American obsession before, in the roomy fighting compartment and the survivable design, the understanding that the physical state of the crew is a combat factor, and that anything which preserves the crew's freshness and function is worth paying for. The rubber track was, among everything else, a crew preservation system. Fourth, it preserved the roads themselves. This sounds minor and is not, because the American Army depended on those roads for the river of trucks that carried its entire logistics. Steel-tracked tanks chew paved roads to rubble, and a column of steel-tracked armor could wreck the very road network that the supply trucks needed. Rubber-faced tracks were far gentler on the roads, helping to preserve the infrastructure that the whole American way of war depended on. It is a systems-level consideration, the tank track designed with the truck route in mind, of exactly the kind the Americans excelled at. So the rubber track was not an indulgence. It bought longer track life, faster road movement, fresher and more effective crews, and preserved roads. 4 real, connected, valuable advantages, every one of which fed into the American way of fighting a mobile, logistics-heavy, crew-preserving war. And the rubber did not stop at the track. Look closer at an American tank and you find rubber elsewhere too, on the road wheels, the wheels along the bottom of the tank that the track runs around. American tanks tended to use rubber-tired road wheels, cushioning the whole running gear, reducing wear and vibration throughout the suspension. As the war went on and rubber grew precious even for America, some designs moved towards steel-rimmed wheels to conserve it. But the instinct, the default, the thing American designers reached for when they could, was rubber, because they understood what it bought, and, crucially, because they had built the capacity to afford it. Think about what that means as a total picture. The American tank was cushioned, top to bottom, on rubber. Rubber on the track faces, rubber on the road wheels, the whole machine riding on a material that Germany could not spare a gram of for the same purpose. Every mile the American tank rolled, it was rolling on a strategic resource that its enemy was rationing by the ounce for tires and gaskets. The contrast is almost absurd when you hold it in your mind. One army so short of rubber it could barely keep its trucks shod, the other cushioning the entire running gear of 30-ton tanks with it, as a matter of routine design. But none of it would have been possible without the thing that truly separated America from Germany here, and it is the deepest part of the story, and it deserves its own place. America solved the rubber problem. Germany could not, because America faced a rubber crisis too, a severe one. When Japan conquered Southeast Asia early in the war, the United States was cut off from the majority of the world's natural rubber supply, almost overnight. This was a genuine strategic emergency, and it could have been crippling, because rubber was essential to everything, tires, and 1,000 other uses. For a moment, America faced the same rubber starvation that dogged Germany throughout the war. And America's response is one of the great industrial achievements of the war, and it is pure American system in action. The United States built, from a standing start, at enormous speed, an entire synthetic rubber industry, a vast national program that constructed dozens of plants and, within a remarkably short time, was producing synthetic rubber in quantities that not only replaced the lost natural rubber but exceeded the nation's needs. America went from a rubber emergency to rubber abundance in the space of a couple of years, through a crash industrial program of a scale and speed that only the American industrial system could have achieved. And that is why America could afford to put rubber on its tank tracks. Not because it started the war with more rubber, it faced its own catastrophe, but because it built, at industrial speed, the capacity to make synthetic rubber in such quantity that it could supply the tires and the gaskets and the 1,000 essential uses, and still have enough left over to face the bottom of its tanks with a scarce strategic material. The rubber track was possible because America had solved, through sheer industrial force, the exact problem that Germany could never solve. Part 3. The River of Steel. The rubber on the tank track, then, is not really a story about tracks at all. It is a story about the American ability to turn a strategic emergency into strategic abundance, and to then spend that abundance on advantages that a poorer enemy could not even contemplate. Consider the synthetic rubber program as an example of the whole American method, because it is one of the purest cases in the entire war. Faced with the loss of natural rubber, the United States did not simply ration what it had and make do, the way a scarcity-bound power must. It mobilized its industrial and scientific base, built an entirely new industry from almost nothing in a staggeringly short time, and produced its way out of the crisis so thoroughly that it ended up with more rubber than it had needed before the crisis began. That is the American answer to scarcity in its purest form, not adaptation to less, but the industrial creation of more. And once the abundance existed, it flowed everywhere, including to places a poorer nation would never dream of spending it. The rubber track is the perfect example, a use of rubber so marginal, so seemingly wasteful, that only a nation swimming in synthetic rubber would even consider it. Germany, scraping together every gram of rubber for essential uses, could never have put rubber on a tank track. America, having built rubber abundance out of a rubber crisis, could face the bottom of every tank with it and not feel the loss. This is the same pattern we have seen with the fuel, the food, the cigarettes, and everything else. America faced the same scarcities as everyone. It was not magically exempt from the material constraints of war. What separated America was the industrial capacity to overcome those scarcities by producing its way out of them, and then the wealth to spend the resulting abundance on advantages, comforts, and refinements that its enemies could not afford. The rubber track is that story in miniature, a scarce material, made abundant by industrial force, and then spent lavishly on the bottom of a tank to buy longer life, faster movement, fresher crews, and better roads. And notice how the rubber track connects to every other American advantage we have examined. Longer track life means more tanks running and fewer in the workshop, the same reliability theme as the interchangeable parts and the recovery vehicles. Fresher crews mean better fighting, the same crew preservation theme as the survivable Sherman and the roomy fighting compartment. Preserved roads mean the supply trucks keep flowing, the same logistics theme as the Red Ball Express. Faster road movement means the mobile war the Americans wanted to fight. Every advantage the rubber track bought fed into an advantage we have already documented, because the rubber track was not a separate thing. It was one more expression of the single integrated philosophy that ran through the entire American war machine. Reliability, crew preservation, logistics, and mobility, all bought with industrial abundance, all the way down to the surface, where the tank met the road. Part 4. The German realization. The Germans understood the rubber track when they encountered it, and their understanding followed the now familiar pattern of this series: recognition of the enemy's advantage, comprehension of how it was achieved, and total inability to copy it. German engineers who examined captured American tanks could see exactly what the rubber track offered. They could measure the longer track life, observe the quieter and smoother running, understand the road preservation benefits. These were not subtle advantages, and German engineers were among the best in the world. They grasped the value of what they were looking at immediately. And they could do absolutely nothing about it, for the single overwhelming reason that governed everything in the German war: they did not have the rubber. It did not matter that the rubber track was better in these respects. It did not matter that German engineers could see its advantages clearly. Germany could not put rubber on its tank tracks because Germany could not get enough rubber for its trucks, and no amount of understanding could conjure a strategic material that the blockade and the limits of synthetic production denied them. The knowledge was useless without the resource, and the resource was exactly what Germany lacked. And the rubber track told the perceptive German observer something even deeper, if he was willing to see it. It told him that the enemy had faced the same rubber catastrophe that Germany faced, the loss of natural rubber supplies, and had responded not by rationing and enduring, as Germany did, but by building an entire new industry that produced its way out of the crisis and into abundance. The rubber on the American tank track was proof that the enemy could take a strategic emergency and, through sheer industrial power, turn it into a surplus so large that it could be spent on the bottoms of tanks. That is a terrifying thing to understand about your enemy, that his response to scarcity is not to do with less, but to build his way to more, faster than you can imagine, and then to have so much that he spends it on refinements you cannot even afford to consider. The German tank ground down the roads on bare steel, tearing up the pavement, wearing out its tracks, punishing its crews with vibration and noise, because Germany had no rubber to spare, and never would. The American tank rolled past on rubber it had manufactured out of a crisis, quieter and faster and longer lasting, its crews fresher, the roads intact behind it, because America had faced the same crisis and simply built its way through it to abundance. The German engineer who examined the rubber track and understood its advantages was looking, one more time, at the unbridgeable gap. Not a gap in knowledge. He understood the rubber track perfectly. A gap in capacity. The Americans could do a thing that Germany could not because they were cleverer, but because they had built an industrial base that could manufacture its way out of any material shortage and into a surplus large enough to waste on the bottom of a tank. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle worked in the synthetic rubber industry, in the crash program that built an entire new industry from nothing to solve one of the war's great material emergencies, or if he was a tanker who road-marched across Europe on those rubber tracks, or a mechanic who maintained them, I would be grateful to hear his name in the comments. The synthetic rubber program was one of the great unsung industrial achievements of the war, and the people who built it are almost never remembered, because a rubber shortage that was solved leaves no dramatic trace. They are mostly gone now. What remains are the stories their families carry. Those stories belong in the record. Part 5. The verdict. 1945. The war ends, and the synthetic rubber industry that America built in its moment of crisis goes on to become a permanent foundation of the modern world, producing the rubber for the tires and the goods of the post-war boom. One more case of a wartime industrial achievement becoming the seed of the peace that followed. So here is the verdict. The rubber on the American tank track is a small thing, and it decided no battles by itself, but it is one of the most revealing small things in this entire series, because it contains the whole American way of war in a single strange detail. The German tank ran on bare steel because Germany was a resource-poor, blockaded power that could not spare rubber for its trucks, let alone its tank tracks, and that made the hard, necessary choices that scarcity forced upon it. The steel track gripped superbly and screamed down the roads and tore up the pavement and wore out fast and battered its crews, and it was, given what Germany had, the only choice that could be made. The American tank ran on rubber because America had faced the same rubber catastrophe and had responded by building an entire new industry that produced its way to abundance, and then had spent that abundance on longer track life, faster movement, fresher crews, and preserved roads, buying with a scarce strategic material a whole cluster of advantages that fed directly into its mobile, logistics-heavy, crew-preserving way of fighting. The German officer who saw rubber on a tank track and thought waste was making, one final time, the error his army made about everything American. He saw a soft, precious material used for a brutal job and thought it frivolous. He did not understand that the frivolity was the point, that only a nation of overwhelming industrial power could afford to put rubber where its tanks met the road, and that the very fact that America could do so was itself the proof of the material dominance that was going to win the war. The Germans could not spare rubber for their trucks. The Americans put it on the bottoms of their tanks, and there is no clearer measure of the distance between a nation that adapted to scarcity and a nation that manufactured its way to abundance. The German tank gripped the mud on screaming steel. The American tank rolled past it on rubber it had built out of a crisis, quieter, faster, longer lasting, and carrying a fresher crew down a road it left intact behind it. If this forensic audit gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It keeps this channel visible to the people who want the history the way it actually happened. Subscribe if you want the next audit, because there are more of these, more systems, more decisions, more of the invisible, unglamorous machinery that decided who won and who came home. And remember this about the people who built the rubber. Nobody makes a film about the chemists and the plant workers who, faced with the sudden loss of the world's rubber supply, built an entire new industry from almost nothing, in a race against catastrophe, and won, producing out of coal and chemistry and sheer determination the rubber that a nation at war could not do without. They did not fire a shot. They worked in plants, far from any battlefield, solving a chemical and industrial problem that could have crippled the war effort and instead became one of its quiet triumphs. They were not trying to be heroes. They were trying to make rubber, fast enough and in enough quantity to matter, because their country needed it, and they knew how. And in doing so, they solved a crisis so completely that the nation ended up with rubber to spare, enough to put on the bottom of every tank, where it met the road, and rolled quieter and faster and longer than any enemy could manage. Mostly, that rubber was there, in abundance, because a crisis had been met by people who answered scarcity the American way, not by making do with less, but by building their way to more. They deserve to be remembered. The chemists, the engineers, the plant workers of the synthetic rubber program, by the humble, world-changing truth that the war was won not only on the battlefield, but in the laboratory and the chemical plant, by people who took a strategic emergency and turned it into an abundance so complete that a nation could afford to spend it on the very bottom of its tanks.